April 7, 1945 dawned cold and clear over Iwo Jima, where Colonel Robert W. Moore stood on the tarmac, watching his pilots strap into their P-51 Mustangs with an expression that betrayed neither confidence nor doubt. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Escort B-29 superfortresses to Tokyo, 660 nautical miles away, a distance that would have been dismissed as fantasy warfare just 18 months earlier. Yet here they were, silvered fighters bristling with newly installed drop tanks that hung beneath their wings like metallic teardrops, each containing enough fuel to transform the impossible into the inevitable. The Japanese High Command had built their defensive strategy around a simple mathematical certainty. American fighters lacked the range to reach the home islands from any captured base. Intelligence reports confirmed this assumption repeatedly throughout 1943 and 1944, allowing Japanese planners to sleep soundly, knowing their interceptors would face only the lumbering bombers, not the swift American fighters that had devastated their forces in the Philippines and Marianas. Lieutenant General Kuniaki Koiso, the Prime Minister himself, had been briefed just 3 months earlier that Tokyo remained beyond fighter escort range, a sanctuary where Japanese pilots could attack the B-29s without facing the dreaded Mustangs that American pilots called the Cadillac of the sky. Captain Yoshio Yoshida of the 3rd Air Division adjusted his goggles in the pre-dawn darkness over Narimasu Airfield, 40 kilometers northwest of Tokyo. His Kawasaki Ki-61 high-end fighter had been scrambled 17 times in the past month to intercept the high-altitude American bombers, and each mission had followed the same pattern. Climb to 30,000 feet, attack the superfortresses from below, avoid their defensive fire, and land before fuel ran out. The Americans brought no escorts because they could not. This tactical reality had become gospel among Japanese fighter pilots, repeated in every briefing, confirmed by every mission. According to declassified United States Army Air Force's historical documents from the National Archives, Japanese intelligence had correctly calculated that standard American fighters operating from the Marianas fell short of Tokyo by nearly 200 miles. Moore's formation lifted off at 0700 hours, 108 P-51D Mustangs from the 7th and 15th Fighter Groups rising into the Pacific morning like a silver cloud. Each aircraft carried 2 75-gallon drop tanks in addition to its internal fuel supply, a modification that transformed the Mustang's combat radius from 475 miles to an unprecedented 750 miles. The pilots had trained for this moment since February, practicing long-distance navigation, fuel management, and high-altitude combat tactics that would be tested against an enemy who believed himself protected by simple geography. Major James Tapp, leading the 15th Fighter Group's 47th Squadron, checked his fuel gauges and compass heading, aware that every gallon would matter in the hours ahead. The formation climbed steadily northward, maintaining radio silence as they passed over the empty Pacific. Below them, the curvature of the Earth stretched endlessly, offering no landmarks, no reference points, only the mathematical certainty of their navigation calculations and the trust each pilot placed in his instruments. They would arrive over Tokyo at approximately 1100 hours, the first American fighter escorts to penetrate Japanese airspace over the capital itself, carrying with them a technological advantage that would shatter Japanese defensive doctrine in a single morning. The B-29 superfortresses appeared first as tiny crosses against the northern horizon at 10:45 hours, 73 massive bombers flying in precise formation at 25,000 feet. Captain Yoshida and his squadron had been vectored toward them by ground controllers whose voices betrayed no unusual concern, only the routine tension of another interception mission. 18 Ki-61 fighters climbed aggressively toward the bomber stream, their pilots calculating attack angles that would minimize exposure to the superfortress's defensive armament while maximizing their own firing opportunities. Yoshida had personally destroyed 2 B-29s in March and damaged 3 others, making him one of the more successful interceptor pilots in the 3rd Air Division. Lieutenant Colonel James Beckham, leading the escort formation from the 7th Fighter Group, spotted the Japanese fighters climbing toward their charges from 15 miles away. His voice crackled across the radio frequency, calm and precise despite the adrenaline coursing through every pilot's veins. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, Angels 22, count 18 plus. The Mustangs had been cruising at 28,000 feet, conserving fuel and maintaining optimal positioning above the bomber stream. Now they rolled into attack dives, dropping their nearly empty external tanks as they accelerated toward the unsuspecting Japanese interceptors with an aggression born of overwhelming tactical advantage. Yoshida never saw them coming. One moment he was lining up his approach on the lead B-29 element. The next, his wingman's aircraft exploded in a spray of aluminum and flame. The radio frequency erupted with confused shouts as Japanese pilots scattered, their orderly attack formation disintegrating into chaos. Yoshida wrenched his fighter into a hard right turn and found himself staring directly at a silver P-51 Mustang barely 100 meters away, its distinctive bubble canopy and streamlined fuselage unmistakable, even in the split second before it flashed past. His mind rejected what his eyes reported. American single-engine fighters here, over Tokyo, where they could not possibly be. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. Captain Robert Dunham of the 45th Fighter Squadron destroyed 3 Japanese fighters in that brief window, his 650 caliber machine guns shredding the lighter-built interceptors with devastating efficiency. The Mustang's superior speed, 444 miles per hour at optimal altitude according to official North American aviation specifications, gave the American pilots an insurmountable advantage in every phase of combat. They could choose when to engage, when to disengage, and dictate the terms of every encounter. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, flying as Yoshida's element leader, attempted to climb away from the melee only to have a Mustang overtake him effortlessly, its concentrated firepower tearing his engine apart in a 3-second burst. Ground controllers at Narimasu and Chofu airfields listened in mounting horror as their pilots reported the impossible. American fighters over the target. Mustangs, dozens of them. Request immediate reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements available who could reach the battle in time, and the controllers possessed no tactical doctrine for this scenario because their planning had assumed it could never occur. Major General Masakazu Kawabe, commanding general of Air Defense General Headquarters, received the initial reports in his underground command post and immediately demanded confirmation, certain that his pilots must be misidentifying the enemy aircraft. The confirmation came within minutes along with the first casualty reports. 7 interceptors destroyed, 4 damaged, 2 pilots confirmed dead. The Mustangs reformed around the bomber stream after breaking off their attack, resuming their escort positions as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. For them, this was simply another mission, albeit one flown at unprecedented range. For the Japanese defenders, it represented the collapse of their fundamental strategic assumptions about American capabilities and the beginning of a new and far more desperate phase of the air war over Japan. The B-29s continued toward their targets unmolested, releasing their payloads with the accuracy that came from facing no fighter opposition during their bombing runs. Major Tadashi Nakajima stood in the operations room at Fuchu Air Defense Headquarters, staring at the plotting board where women in khaki uniforms moved colored markers representing the American formation. He had commanded interceptor squadrons since 1942. Fighting over China, the Philippines, and finally the home islands themselves. He understood aircraft performance, combat tactics, and the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare. What he could not understand was the neat row of silver fighter symbols now tracking southward from Tokyo Bay, their presence in Japanese airspace representing a technological achievement that invalidated 3 years of defensive planning. "They will run out of fuel," said Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto, the operations officer, his voice carrying more hope than conviction. "They cannot possibly return to Iwo Jima from here." The 2 officers watched the plot board in silence, waiting for the American formation to turn back, to show signs of fuel exhaustion, to confirm that this mission was a one-way suicide attack rather than a sustainable tactical capability. The minutes passed. The silver markers continued south, maintaining formation, their leisurely pace suggesting pilots conserving fuel rather than racing against empty tanks. 600 miles south aboard the carrier USS Bunker Hill steaming off Okinawa, Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman read the initial contact reports with satisfaction. The operation had been controversial during planning sessions in February, with several senior officers expressing skepticism that the Mustangs could actually reach Tokyo and return. North American aviation engineers had provided the theoretical calculations, but theory and practice diverged frequently in warfare. Sherman had authorized the mission based on confidence in both the aircraft and the pilots, and that confidence now appeared justified by the radio reports filtering in from the bomber commanders who praised their fighter escort's performance. Captain Yoshida managed to coax his damaged Ki-61 back to Naramas airfield, landing with his engine trailing smoke and his hydraulics nearly depleted. Ground crews rushed to his aircraft as he climbed out, their faces reflecting the same confusion and fear that gripped every pilot who had survived the encounter. In the pilot's ready room, the survivors gathered to debrief, their accounts painting a consistent picture. American fighters had appeared without warning, engaged with overwhelming effectiveness, and departed with no apparent fuel concerns. Flight Sergeant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with 64 confirmed victories, listened to the younger pilot's descriptions and recognized the strategic implications immediately. Historical records from the Japanese Defense Ministry, referenced in numerous post-war analyses including those compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, indicate that the April 7th mission prompted an emergency conference at Imperial General Headquarters that same evening. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, presented the situation to a gathering of senior commanders with uncharacteristic bluntness. The Americans now possessed the capability to escort their heavy bombers throughout Japanese airspace, meaning interceptor squadrons would face continuous combat against qualitatively superior aircraft flown by well-trained pilots. The defensive strategy that had relied on attacking unescorted bombers had become obsolete in a single morning. The sun set over Tokyo that evening on a city largely unaware of the day's significance. Most civilians knew only that another air raid had occurred, the sirens had wailed, and the B-29s had come and gone as they had done dozens of times before. They did not know that the silver fighters seen by some observers represented a fundamental shift in the air war, or that the protective distance they had unconsciously relied upon had vanished. In the headquarters bunkers and airfield operations rooms, however, Japanese commanders understood perfectly. The Emperor's sky had been breached, and there existed no simple solution to restore the protective barrier that geography had once provided. April 9, 1945, brought the second escorted raid against Tokyo, this time with 123 P-51 Mustangs protecting 89 B-29 super fortresses targeting aircraft factories in the Nakajima district. Lieutenant General Kawabe had spent the intervening 48 hours reorganizing defensive tactics, issuing directives that acknowledged reality. Japanese fighters must now engage American escorts before attacking the bombers, accepting higher casualties in exchange for even minimal success against the primary targets. The new doctrine represented a death sentence for many interceptor pilots, and everyone in the command structure understood this grim calculus. Captain Teruo Yamaguchi led 12 Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate fighters, Japan's most advanced operational fighter, into combat that morning, with orders to tie down the American escorts, while a second wave attacked the bombers from high altitude. The Ki-84 could reach 427 miles per hour at optimal altitude, making it theoretically competitive with the Mustang in speed if not in range or firepower. Yamaguchi had flown combat missions since Pearl Harbor, surviving 4 years of warfare through skill and calculated aggression. He understood that his mission was essentially suicidal: engage numerically superior enemies possessing every tactical advantage, hold them in combat long enough for the second wave to attack, and hope to survive the encounter. The Mustangs met them head-on at 26,000 feet. Major Thomas Griffin, commanding the 78th Fighter Squadron, led his flight directly into the Japanese formation with the confidence of a pilot who knew his aircraft's capabilities exceeded his opponents in every measurable category. The Ki-84s scattered under the initial assault, attempting to draw the Americans into individual dogfights that might neutralize the Mustang's speed advantage through superior maneuverability. It was sound tactical thinking, based on previous combat experience against earlier American fighters, but the P-51D possessed both speed and maneuverability, a combination that proved devastating in skilled hands. Yamaguchi destroyed one Mustang through desperate aggression, closing to point-blank range before firing, but lost 4 aircraft from his formation in exchange. His radio crackled with voices calling out attacks, announcing damage, requesting assistance that could not be provided. The second wave of Japanese fighters attempting to reach the bombers found themselves intercepted by another flight of Mustangs before they could climb to attack altitude, the American fighters having sufficient numbers to maintain protective coverage throughout the bomber stream, while simultaneously engaging the interceptors. The tactical arithmetic was brutally simple. Japan could put perhaps 40 fighters over Tokyo at any given time, while the Americans could bring 100-plus escorts who could remain over target longer due to superior fuel management. Research compiled by the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base indicates that Japanese fighter losses over the home islands increased by 300% following the introduction of long-range Mustang escorts, while B-29 losses to fighter attacks declined by 70% during the same period. These statistics, dry as they appear in historical documents, represented individual tragedies and tactical failures that cascaded through the Japanese air defense system. Experienced pilots like Yamaguchi found themselves fighting losing battles every time they took off, their tactical skill negated by strategic disadvantages they could not overcome through courage or determination alone. By mid-afternoon on April 9th, Yamaguchi sat in a damaged ready room at Narimasu Airfield, writing letters to the families of the 3 pilots from his squadron who would not return. Outside, ground crews prepared aircraft for the next mission, despite knowing that parts and fuel grew scarcer each week. The Americans would come again tomorrow or the next day, and Japanese fighters would rise to meet them because the alternative was to surrender the sky without fighting. But everyone involved understood the trajectory. Each mission degraded Japanese defensive capabilities while American capabilities continued expanding, a mathematical progression leading toward an inevitable conclusion that no one wished to speak aloud. April 16, 1945 marked the beginning of systematic attacks against Japan's aircraft production facilities, with P-51 escorts enabling B-29s to conduct precision bombing in daylight without prohibitive losses. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had advocated for this mission profile since January, but lacked the fighter cover necessary to make it viable. The arrival of the 7th and 15th Fighter Groups on Iwo Jima solved his tactical problem, transforming the superfortresses from vulnerable night raiders into precisely targeted instruments of industrial destruction. Captain Kenji Fujita managed production at the Musashino Aircraft Engine Plant, one of the largest military industrial facilities remaining operational in the Tokyo region. His plant employed 3,000 workers producing engines for Ki-84 fighters and Ki-67 bombers, operating around the clock despite material shortages and increasingly frequent air raid disruptions. On the morning of April 16th, Fujita watched from the plant's reinforced command center as air raid sirens wailed and workers rushed to shelters. He had witnessed dozens of raids, but something about this formation seemed different. The bombers flew lower than usual, their approach steady and methodical rather than the scattered patterns typical of night attacks. The first bomb struck the northern assembly halls at 11:23 hours with devastating precision. Lieutenant Marcus Anderson, bombardier aboard the B-29 Lucky Lady, flying at 23,000 feet, released his payload using the Norden bombsight's optical targeting system, a device that performed superbly in clear daylight conditions, but proved nearly useless during the night missions that had characterized previous months. His bombs fell in a textbook pattern, walking across the factory complex with destructive efficiency that would have been impossible under night attack conditions. 12 other B-29s in his formation added their payloads, saturating the target area with high explosive bombs that collapsed structures and ignited secondary fires throughout the facility. Fujita emerged from his shelter an hour later to find his plant transformed into smoking rubble. 3 of the 4 main assembly buildings had been destroyed or rendered inoperative, machine tools buried under collapsed roofs, critical equipment damaged beyond field repair. He stood amid the destruction trying to calculate recovery timelines and quickly realized the futility of such calculations. Even if they could clear the rubble and salvage equipment, the Americans would simply return in days or weeks and bomb them again, this time with even greater precision. The protective distance that had once limited such attacks to nighttime harassment missions had vanished, replaced by American fighter escorts that permitted sustained daylight precision bombing. According to documentation from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted immediately following Japan's surrender, The systematic daylight bombing campaign enabled by long-range fighter escorts reduced Japanese aircraft production by 62% between April and August 1945. This decline affected not just total numbers, but also the quality and completeness of aircraft reaching operational squadrons. Fighters rolled off assembly lines with missing instruments, substandard engines, and incomplete armament, while trained pilots grew increasingly scarce as combat attrition outpaced training programs, already hampered by fuel shortages. Colonel Nakajima visited the Musashino plant ruins 3 days after the attack, conducting damage assessment for Air Defense Headquarters. His report to General Kawabe painted a stark picture. Continued operations at this facility would require complete reconstruction under conditions of American air superiority, an undertaking that would cost more resources than dispersing production to smaller, harder-to-target facilities. But dispersal brought its own problems: reduced efficiency, increased coordination difficulties, and the reality that Mustang escorts now range throughout Japanese airspace, making no location truly safe from attack. The aluminum fortress that was supposed to protect Japan through industrial might and technological prowess was crumbling under the weight of American tactical innovations that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. May 7, 1945 found Flight Sergeant Saburo Sakai leading a 6-plane formation of A6M50 fighters in what pilots had begun calling body-crashing attacks, not formal kamikaze missions, but conventional interceptions where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. Fuel shortages had become critical throughout Japanese military aviation, with operational squadrons receiving barely enough fuel to scramble, engage, and land with minimal reserves. Sakai's formation carried half loads in their internal tanks, accepting reduced flight time in exchange for getting airborne at all. The mathematics of aerial combat had shifted decisively against Japanese defenders. American Mustangs could loiter over Japanese airspace for 45 minutes after transit from Iwo Jima, engaging targets of opportunity and providing continuous escort coverage for the bomber streams. Japanese interceptors scrambled with perhaps 20 minutes of combat fuel, forcing pilots to commit to attacks immediately or risk running dry before landing. This temporal asymmetry proved as decisive as any performance advantage, with American pilots choosing when and how to engage, while Japanese pilots operated under constant fuel pressure that eliminated tactical flexibility. Sakai engaged a formation of Mustangs over Yokohama at 18,000 feet, his Zero's superior maneuverability allowing him brief advantage in the turning fight that followed. He fired at a Mustang flown by Lieutenant James McDonald of the 15th Fighter Group, seeing his round strike the American aircraft's wing root. McDonald broke away trailing smoke, heading out to sea with apparent damage. But 3 other Mustangs converged on Sakai's position immediately, their combined firepower forcing him into a desperate dive that exhausted precious fuel and left him separated from his formation. He managed to reach Atsugi Airfield with his fuel gauge reading empty, the engine coughing as he touched down. In the operations room at Yokota Airfield, Major Nakajima reviewed loss reports with the detached numbness of someone who had seen too many friends die. May 7th's missions had cost 18 Japanese fighters destroyed and 12 damaged, against 3 American fighters downed, and one of those 3 had been recovered along with its pilot by an American submarine operating brazenly in Sagami Bay. The exchange rate was unsustainable, consuming in weeks what had taken years to build. Worse, the quality of replacement pilots continued declining as training programs shortened and fuel allocations for instruction flights diminished. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with 40 hours of flight time, facing American pilots who averaged 300 hours plus combat experience. The fuel crisis affected every aspect of Japanese air operations. According to post-war testimony compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan's aviation gasoline production declined from 750,000 kiloliters per month in January 1945 to less than 150,000 kiloliters by June, with American submarine interdiction and bombing of refineries accelerating the decline. This shortage forced impossible choices: allocate fuel to training programs and accept fewer operational sorties, or maximize operational flights and accept poorly trained pilots who died quickly against experienced opponents. Japanese commanders chose the latter, prioritizing immediate tactical needs over long-term strategic sustainability because they lacked the luxury of time to rebuild properly. Sakai sat in the pilot's ready room that evening, smoking one of the increasingly scarce cigarettes and contemplating the war's trajectory. He had survived 4 years of combat through skill, experience, and calculated aggression, but he recognized that individual skill mattered less each day. The Americans had built a system: long-range fighters, extensive pilot training, overwhelming material production, that defeated even the most skillful individual opponents through sheer systemic advantage. You could outfly a Mustang pilot on any given day, but you could not outfly 100 Mustang pilots supported by unlimited fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft. The mathematics were inexorable, pointing toward conclusions that everyone understood but few wished to articulate. June 4, 1945, brought another milestone. P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima conducted fighter sweeps over Osaka and Kobe without bomber escort, seeking out remaining Japanese fighters and strafing airfields in what amounted to offensive air superiority missions deep inside Japanese territory. Captain Robert Dunham, now credited with 11 confirmed victories, led a flight of 8 Mustangs on a low-altitude attack against Itami Airfield, destroying 6 Japanese aircraft on the ground and damaging the runway with fragmentation bombs. His formation encountered no air opposition during the 40-minute attack, with Japanese fighters either grounded by fuel shortages or unwilling to engage against such overwhelming tactical disadvantage. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. Japanese pilots who had once scrambled aggressively to meet every threat now found themselves ordered to remain grounded unless specifically directed to intercept, conserving both fuel and aircraft for some future decisive battle that commanders could not clearly define. This defensive posture represented complete reversal of doctrine from just 3 months earlier, when aggressive interception had been standard procedure. The change reflected brutal realization. Japan could not win the air war through tactical engagement, so commanders sought only to preserve forces for whatever final battle might come. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, one of the few survivors from the April 7th mission, received orders transferring him to the 10th Air Division's Special Attack Unit on June 10th. The reassignment required no explanation. Special attack meant kamikaze operations, where pilots flew one-way missions carrying bombs to deliberately crash into enemy ships or installations. Shiga accepted the transfer without protest, understanding that conventional fighter operations had become exercises in futility. If his death served Japan, better to die in a purposeful attack than in another hopeless interception mission against American fighters that could neither be caught nor escaped. The Americans expanded their operations throughout June, with Mustangs ranging across the entire Japanese home islands seeking targets of opportunity. Major Thomas Griffin led missions against transportation infrastructure, strafing locomotives and coastal vessels, while bomber formations above him methodically dismantled what remained of Japanese industrial capacity. The coordination between fighter sweeps and bomber attacks created a synergistic effect. Japanese fighters that scrambled to engage the Mustangs left the bombers unmolested, while fighters that focused on the bombers exposed themselves to devastating attacks from the escorts. Either choice led to losses Japan could not afford. Statistical analysis from Air Force Historical Research Agency documents reveals the scope of Japanese air power's collapse between April and July 1945. Operational fighter strength declined from approximately 1,500 aircraft to fewer than 400, with sortie rates falling even more dramatically due to fuel shortages and the concentration of remaining forces for anticipated invasion defense. American losses declined proportionally, with bomber losses to fighter attack dropping to less than 1% per mission by July, a rate so low it barely influenced mission planning. The aerial battlefield had become entirely one-sided, with American forces operating throughout Japanese airspace essentially unopposed. Captain Yoshida, grounded since May by lack of both fuel and operational aircraft, spent his days training new pilots in tactics he knew they would never effectively employ. The young men, some barely 18 years old, listened attentively to his lectures on energy management, deflection shooting, and combat formations, but Yoshida recognized the futility of such instruction. These pilots would fly once or twice before dying, their brief lives spent in unequal combat against opponents whose systematic advantages negated any tactical knowledge Yoshida could impart. He taught them anyway because that was his duty, but he did. So, with the heavy heart of someone who knew he was preparing students for sacrifice, rather than victory, August 6, 1945 dawned with unusual clarity over Hiroshima, where citizens prepared for another day of diminished rations and air raid precautions. At 08:15 hours, the B-29 Enola Gay released a single atomic bomb that detonated 43 seconds later at an altitude of 1,900 feet, initiating a chain reaction that killed 80,000 people instantly and condemned another 60,000 to death from radiation exposure in the following months. No Japanese fighters rose to intercept the bomber, despite clear weather and advanced radar detection, because Air Defense Headquarters had assessed the single aircraft as a reconnaissance mission, unworthy of wasting precious fuel on interception. The same calculation occurred 3 days later over Nagasaki, where another atomic bomb fell without fighter opposition. These missions represented the culmination of air power trends that had begun in April when P-51 Mustangs first appeared over Tokyo, carrying drop tanks that Japanese intelligence had assured commanders were impossible. The Americans had achieved absolute air superiority through a combination of technological innovation, systematic planning, and overwhelming material resources, creating conditions where the most strategically significant missions of the entire war flew unopposed because Japanese defenders no longer possessed the means to contest them. Captain Yoshida heard the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15th, while standing on what remained of Naramasu Airfield, its runways cratered by repeated American attacks and its few surviving aircraft hidden in dispersed revetments. The broadcast surprised no one in the air defense forces. They had understood for months that Japan could not win, that each day brought only additional losses without meaningful operational success. What surprised Yoshida was the relief he felt. Relief that the fighting would end, that no more young pilots would die in his command, that the mathematical progression toward complete destruction had finally been interrupted by political decision. Major General Kawabe surrendered his command to American occupation forces in September, handing over documents that detailed the systematic degradation of Japanese air defenses between April and August. American intelligence officers studying these records found confirmation of what they had suspected. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts had proven decisive, not just tactically, but strategically, enabling precision bombing campaigns that would have been impossible under the previous operational constraints. The Mustangs' drop tanks, those cylindrical appendages that Japanese pilots first encountered on April 7th, had transformed American tactical range from a limiting factor into a strategic weapon. Saburo Sakai survived the war, and later wrote extensively about his experiences, providing historians with detailed accounts of the April through August period from a Japanese pilot's perspective. His writings emphasize the psychological impact of facing an enemy who possessed every advantage: better aircraft, more fuel, superior numbers, comprehensive training, and the tactical flexibility that came from operating without the desperate constraints that characterized Japanese operations. According to Sakai's post-war memoirs, the appearance of Mustangs over Tokyo represented the moment when most experienced Japanese pilots recognized that conventional victory had become impossible, though few voiced this conclusion openly at the time. The P-51 Mustang flew its last combat missions over Japan in mid-August, having participated in over 300 escort missions and fighter sweeps that collectively established the conditions for Japan's surrender. The aircraft's contribution to victory emerged not from any single mission, but from the cumulative effect of sustained operations that Japanese defenders could neither prevent nor effectively counter. Those drop tanks that seemed so impossible in Japanese intelligence assessments had proven devastatingly real, transforming the strategic geography of the Pacific War by erasing the protective distance that Japanese planners had relied upon. Captain Robert Dunham returned to the United States in October 1945 with 14 confirmed aerial victories and a Distinguished Flying Cross, resuming civilian life as if the previous years had been merely an interruption rather than the defining experience of his generation. He rarely spoke about the missions over Japan, offering only vague responses when asked about combat. But in private moments, he remembered April 7, 1945, the first mission over Tokyo, when his flight had appeared over enemy territory where everyone had said American fighters could not reach, and Japanese pilots had scattered in confusion before an impossibility made manifest. That mission had lasted barely 4 hours from takeoff to landing, but it had changed the Pacific War's trajectory in ways that would take historians decades to fully comprehend and document.